Deep in the heart of Oregon, there lies a stretch of forest so dense, so remote that few venture into its depths. The locals call it the Blackwood, a place that, over the years, has become synonymous with fear and disappearance. The trees here are ancient towering giants whose twisted limbs block out the sky, shrouding the forest floor in perpetual twilight. It's a place where time seems to stand still, where the air is thick with the scent of decay and something else, something that smells of rot and earth, a scent that clings to your skin long after you've left. It was late autumn when Mark, a seasoned outdoorsman, decided to explore the Blackwood. He had heard the stories, of course. Everyone in the surrounding towns had, but he was not the superstitious type. To him, the Blackwood was just another forest, albeit one with a reputation that had been blown out of proportion by old legends and overactive imaginations. He was confident that he could handle whatever the forest had to offer. Mark wasn't alone on this trip. He had brought his younger brother, Jake, a city boy who had little experience with the wilderness, but was eager for adventure. They had planned this trip for weeks, excited to disconnect from the world and lose themselves in nature. The plan was simple: hike deep into the Blackwood, set up camp for a few days, and then return, with nothing but memories of the untouched beauty they had discovered. The first day went as planned. The hike was challenging, but the brothers were in high spirits. The forest, despite its eerie reputation, was breathtakingly beautiful. The trees were covered in moss, and the ground was a carpet of fallen leaves that crunched underfoot. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves, the occasional call of a distant bird, and the steady rhythm of their footsteps. As the sun began to set, they found a small clearing to set up camp, and by nightfall, they had a fire going and were enjoying the simplicity of being in the wild. But as the night wore on, the atmosphere began to change. The temperature dropped suddenly, the air growing cold and damp. The fire, which had been burning brightly, started to sputter, the flames shrinking despite the fact that they had plenty of dry wood. Mark noticed it first, the unnatural quiet that had fallen over the forest, the sounds of the night, the insects and nocturnal creatures that should have been active were absent. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. "Do you hear that?" Jake asked, his voice barely a whisper. Mark nodded, feeling a prickle of unease. "Yeah, it's too quiet." They sat in silence listening, but there was nothing to hear. The quiet was oppressive, a heavy blanket that pressed down on them, making it hard to breathe. Mark tried to shake off the feeling, attributing it to the natural tension of being in an unfamiliar place, but deep down he couldn't ignore the gnawing sense that something was wrong. They decided to turn in for the night, hoping that sleep would come, and with it, the comfort of daylight. But sleep didn't come easily. Mark lay awake in his tent, staring at the thin fabric that separated him from the darkness outside. Every creak, every rustle of the wind seemed amplified, like the forest was alive, moving around them, watching. At some point during the night, Mark was jolted awake by a sound that cut through the silence like a knife. It was faint, distant, but unmistakable. The sound of a woman crying. It was low and mournful, the kind of sound that raises the hairs on the back of your neck. Mark sat up, his heart pounding in his chest. He glanced over at Jake, who was still asleep, oblivious to the sound. Mark listened, trying to pinpoint where the sound was coming from, but it seemed to be all around him, echoing through the trees. He thought about waking Jake, but something stopped him. The crying. It didn't sound right. There was something off about it, something that made his blood run cold. It was as if the sound wasn't quite human, as if it was being imitated by something that didn't know what human sorrow truly sounded like. He lay back down, forcing himself to stay calm, to ignore the rising tide of fear in his chest. He told himself it was just the wind, or maybe a trick of the mind, but the crying continued, growing louder, more insistent. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Mark didn't sleep for the rest of the night. He lay there, wide-eyed, every muscle tense, waiting for the sound to return. But it didn't. Eventually, the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, and with it came a sense of relief, as if the forest had exhaled, releasing the tension that had gripped it through the night. When Jake woke up, Mark didn't mention the crying. He didn't want to scare him, didn't want to admit that he had been scared himself. Instead, they packed up their camp and continued deeper into the forest, though Mark couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that something was following them. As they hiked, the forest seemed to grow darker, the trees closing in around them. The path they were following became harder to discern, overgrown with thorny bushes and tangled roots that seemed to reach out, trying to trip them. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay, and the light that filtered through the canopy above was dim and cold, casting long, eerie shadows on the ground. They didn't talk much, the oppressive atmosphere weighing heavily on them. Mark could see that Jake was starting to feel it too, the unease that had settled over them since the previous night. But neither of them wanted to be the one to suggest turning back. Pride and stubbornness kept them moving forward deeper into the heart of the Blackwood. By late afternoon, they reached a small, stagnant pond, its surface covered in a thick layer of green algae. The water was dark and murky, reflecting the twisted branches of the trees that loomed over it. Mark suggested they take a break, and they sat down on the damp ground, their backs against the rough bark of a tree. As they rested, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them from across the pond. He scanned the tree line, his eyes searching for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. Just the stillness of the forest, the oppressive quiet that seemed to swallow all sound. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. A shadow, a flicker of movement among the trees. It was quick, almost too quick to catch, but Mark was sure he had seen something. His heart began to race as he strained to see through the gloom, but whatever it was had vanished, leaving only the rustling of leaves in its wake. "Did you see that?" Mark asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jake looked at him, confusion and fear in his eyes. "See what?" Mark shook his head, not wanting to alarm his brother. "Nothing. Just thought I saw something." But Jake's expression told him that he wasn't the only one who had seen it, whatever it was. They sat in silence for a moment longer. Then Mark stood up, brushing the dirt off his pants. "Let's keep moving," he said, trying to sound casual. "We need to find a place to camp before it gets dark." They continued on, but the sense of unease only grew stronger as the day wore on. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees pressing closer, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The path became harder to follow, the undergrowth thicker, more tangled. It was as if the forest itself was trying to trap them, to keep them from leaving. By the time they found a suitable spot to set up camp, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The air was cold, the scent of decay more potent than ever. Mark's nerves were on edge, every sound, every rustle of leaves, putting him on high alert. They built a fire, the flames flickering weakly in the cold, damp air. As they sat around it, Mark noticed that the forest had gone quiet again, the same unnatural silence that had fallen the night before. He could see the fear in Jake's eyes, though neither of them spoke of it. They were both trying to stay calm, to pretend that everything was normal, but the tension in the air was palpable. It was then that Mark noticed the carvings on the trees surrounding their campsite. They were crude, almost childlike, but there was something deeply unsettling about them. Symbols that seemed to pulse with a dark energy, as if they were alive. Mark's heart sank as he realized that these were the same symbols that had been described in the stories he had heard about the Blackwood. The same symbols that were said to mark the territory of something ancient and malevolent. "Jake," Mark said, his voice shaking, "we need to leave. Now." Jake looked at him, confusion and fear etched on his face. "What? Why?" Mark pointed to the carvings, his hand trembling. "These symbols, they're not good. We need to get out of here before it gets dark." But as he spoke, the fire sputtered out, plunging them into darkness. The temperature dropped sharply, and the air became thick with the scent of rot and decay. The oppressive silence was broken by a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from all around them, reverberating through the trees. Mark and Jake stood frozen, their eyes wide with terror. The growl grew louder, more menacing, and the trees around them began to creak and groan as if something massive was moving through the forest. The ground beneath their feet began to tremble, and the air was filled with the sound of snapping branches and rustling leaves. "Run!" Mark shouted, grabbing Jake's arm and pulling him into the trees. They ran blindly through the forest, the growling sound following them, growing louder, closer. The trees seemed to reach out, trying to grab them, the ground shifting and twisting beneath their feet. Mark could feel something behind them, something huge and powerful, something that shouldn't exist. The growling turned into a roar, and Mark felt a cold, wet breath on the back of his neck. He stumbled, his foot catching on a root, and he fell to the ground, his breath knocked out of him. Jake stopped, turning back to help his brother, but Mark waved him on. "Go!" Mark gasped, struggling to get to his feet. "Just go!" But Jake didn't move. He stood frozen, his eyes wide with terror, staring at something behind Mark. Mark turned slowly, his heart pounding in his chest, and saw what had paralyzed his brother with fear. It was massive, a hulking shadow that loomed over them, its eyes glowing with a sickly green light. Its body was twisted and misshapen, covered in matted fur and scales. Its face was a grotesque parody of a human, with sharp teeth and sunken eyes that seemed to bore into Mark's soul. Mark tried to move, to run, but his legs wouldn't respond. He was trapped, caught in the creature's gaze, unable to look away. The creature let out a low, rumbling growl, and Mark felt a cold, sharp pain in his chest, as if the creature's gaze was piercing through him. Then, with a sudden, violent motion, the creature lunged forward, its massive jaws snapping shut around Mark's torso. Mark screamed, the pain unbearable, as the creature lifted him into the air, its teeth sinking deeper into his flesh. He could feel his bones cracking, his blood pouring out, his vision dimming. But just as suddenly as it had attacked, the creature released him, dropping him to the ground. Mark lay there, gasping for breath, his body broken and bleeding. The creature stood over him, its glowing eyes watching, waiting. Mark knew he was going to die, but he wasn't afraid anymore. The pain was fading, his vision growing darker. He closed his eyes, letting the darkness take him, and the last thing he heard was the sound of the creature's growl, echoing through the trees.